We're at the FHIR connectathon in Paris, where we have 2 rooms full of people testing various FHIR scenarios. And very specifically, we have one new test scenario, which is about version 2 messages to FHIR. Now, this means not just the transformation of version 2 content segments to FHIR resources, but also dealing with any differences in the messaging paradigm in version 2, including snapshots of information, snapshot mode, for example, to resources. So let's see what the experiences are.
Version 2, of course, is one of the most successful HL7 specifications that we've got out there, and as FHIR starts to permeate throughout the space, I think we're going to come across very early the issue of trying to integrate systems that are using V2 messaging and wish to use FHIR. I actually see that as being one of the earlier things that we'll try to do outside of the greenfield FHIR things. So I think that's why it's important for us to work on this. And I think V2 was very much a bottom-up specification. It was developed by people who were solving problems as they went. We now know a lot of what those problems actually are, so we're in an ideal opportunity, I think, to learn from what we've done before and to come up with that set of best practice guidelines.
What we have done for this connectathon is that we are processing an HL7 version 2 ADT message, meaning patient admission, discharge, transfer, and changes of the patient. And our challenge was to implement the re-identification of the patient by its identifier, which is not the same as the logical ID that the FHIR server needs in order to perform the RESTful operation. So we were relying heavily on the features that are implemented in the new DSTU2, like transaction bundling or message type bundling that allows for the conditional update, where we can re-identify a patient by a certain criteria that we retrieve from the version 2 message. And we are testing 3 different approaches. We have the message bundle implemented, but we found that the message endpoints on the server side are not yet implemented, so we couldn't test that. But we were able to do the same by using transaction bundles, but there's one deficit there, that we cannot do the snapshot style update of the allergy resources that this track required. But we can re-identify patient and encounters and update them by their by the identifier that we retrieve from the HL7 version 2 message. So that's working. And we also created a custom Java-based driver that relies on the HAPI interface that pretty much drills down the whole bundling of the resources and picks individual resources from the bundle and does atomic RESTful operations. So if we have a kind of what we call quote stupid server that only supports the atomic REST transaction REST operations and no transaction, no bundling, no message endpoint, we still be able to process the whole version 2 message and correctly re-identify and update the resources on the server. We've done that with the Cloverleaf integration server, because that's what the hospitals have in place when they are doing their internal version 2 message routing and transformation. So the messages are already there in the hospitals, and now we can also reuse these data and populate a FHIR server with the patient demographics.
We're also going to show you it'll not take long, really, the ADT connector. So we translated some of the ADT messages into FHIR resources and then posted them to our own FHIR server. It took us a little bit longer than we thought. We didn't really have anything before we came, so we didn't get all the way through track 2. But we'll show you what we've got.
What we've done is to develop tooling that allows us to migrate between version 2 and FHIR resources. So far it's worked pretty well, but as I say, it's really been an experimental rather than real life, so very much looking forward to participating in the community to figure out what the issues and problems are. And particularly I think the track that we organised at Connectathon, which unfortunately I haven't been able to participate in, I think is going to be important. But I think moving forward, what I'd really like to see is the community getting together to solve this issue, because I think it's going to be really important for us to do so. And I think we should try and solve it as a group, as a community, rather than as individual companies.
So some of the challenges that I faced when doing the HL7 version 2 to FHIR mapping were there are some challenges when you map the data elements over into FHIR, because sometimes it's not a one-to-one map, and you may have to put logic in place to gather the data or look for the data in different spots in the HL7 version 2 message, and then put some logic in place to put it into the FHIR resource. Additionally, there were some challenges around just code table lookups, where the FHIR code tables obviously don't have a one-to-one match with the HL7 version 2, and so you have to do some tricky mapping to get the codes translated over into the FHIR code sets. Now that could be brokered somewhat with some fancy cross-reference tables, but you have to still make some assumptions on some of those codes and get those cross-reference tables set up. Other than that, the FHIR is very easy to use. The transactions and the concepts around storing the resources on the FHIR server are very simple, and it's a small learning curve, or a quick learning curve, to get those resources in.
We tried different approaches to the whole problem. I mean, this is the version 2 message that we have. We know that our patient needs to be transferred to a different location, and we created a message bundle. We have all that put in a message bundle, and by definition, a message bundle is supposed to, we give the message bundle to the server, and the server is supposed to do all the business logic to know, is this a patient I already know by the same identifier? Do I have to update, or do I have to insert? The server would be supposed to delete or to purge all the allergy intolerances and replace them with the actual ones. But of course we soon realized that none of the public servers that are available at this point have this kind of logic associated with the messaging endpoint. So we tried two different approaches to the problem. The one thing is we used the transaction bundle instead of the message bundle, because in this we could add additional parameters to each and every resource, which is the conditional update. We say we have a patient here, and we're not sure if it's already on the server, so we try to update it. But if you update, you actually need to provide the URL, and we don't know the URL of the patient. So instead, we did the conditional update and said we want to update a patient that has the identifier by the system that we assign to the identifier in the first message, and has this patient ID. We know the patient ID from the version 2 message, so we can give that information to the server. But there's also something else. Since we do not know the URL of the patient, how do we reference from the encounter to the patient? So we have to assign a temporary ID, which we did right here. We just made up an ID. We just said, oh, let's use our patient identifier, it doesn't matter. We just gave the resource a temporal ID and used that one in the encounter resource. That's right here. Here's the encounter. And the encounter references to the patient right here. So here we have our the identifier that we made up, and in this transaction the server has to replace this made up identifier with the actual identifier that the patient the server assigned in the patient transaction.
So if you start looking at some of the issues that you encounter when you do the translation, then first of all, obviously we're going to start with the version 2 message, and let's say it consists of a number of segments. And normally when we talk about messaging, that means that this message will be sent to some receiving party, and the receiving party will execute some level of business rules processing on the receipt of that message. It may kick off a workflow, they may make decisions as to which part of the message needs to be persisted and which other parts may simply be ignored. So this is supported by FHIR, but the whole problem is that currently we have no servers that actually support this processing and partial, maybe, persistence creation in some kind of persistence layer. So what we're doing is creating this workaround, and that's exactly what you saw in the presentation by Simone, is to take this version 2 message and send it to some sort of communication engine, and it will basically approximate the simplistic behavior of the processing of the original message by making decisions about which parts of the original version 2 message should be persisted, and then you basically create individual updates or deletes in our persistence store. But it's not messaging, because it doesn't execute the business rules and the choices and the workflows that are normally done when you send a message. So this is one of the issues that, although this is a nice workaround and a nice testing environment, it's certainly not going to be realistic. Another issue is around the updates, and you heard about update mode being an issue, because what if I have 2 allergies in this particular message, okay, and subsequently I send an update message that only happens to have 1. Now the problem is that in this approach, that the communication server would somehow have to find out that with respect to the latest snapshot, where there is now just 1, I will have to delete one of the allergies from the database. Now there may be clinical safety and other clinical issues around actually deleting something from a database, but leaving that aside for a second, you'll have to determine that somehow by querying the persistence layer to find out what the existing allergies were prior to actually updating stuff. Another issue concerns identity. Because we have the mapping, yes, between, let's say, version 2 segments and resources, not entirely one-to-one, but roughly equivalent. But if you send this message to the communication server and you want to translate it into one big transaction to send to the persistence archive, you actually in the communication server have no clue as to what identities, local identifiers, URLs, have been assigned to these resources in a prior message. So you'll have to use either a get to get hold of the identifiers of any logical identifiers of any existing resources, or you'll have to use the conditional update feature, which allows you to update something based on a business identifier, for example, a patient number. The patient number is not part of the URL, but using a conditional update or create or delete, I can do stuff using a business identifier. So these are just some of the first issues that we saw during the version 2 to FHIR track, which we tested during the Paris connectathon. We will repeat the same track in Atlanta and in Amsterdam later this year in an attempt to tease out some of the best practices around version 2 to FHIR mapping to FHIR messages for processing, or directly as a workaround to a transaction which can then be used to update a persistence layer.